How does one analyze something as iconic as Michael Myers? I'd say that the quote I just showed you is a perfect description of Myers. It's from the original Halloween movie, dating all the way back to 1978. Michael is iconic. There's no other way to say it. A legend of horror, it only makes sense that Dead by Daylight would try to get the license to use this classic character. This video will serve as a retrospective to the thing behind the mask, as well as the other pieces of content that the Shape brought to the game. Myers was added to DBD all the way back in October of 2016. He was the second killer ever added to the base roster, while also being the first time Dead by Daylight introduced a licensed character to the game. I'm still really surprised Behavior was able to get the license for the Halloween franchise. Dead by Daylight was by no means a small game at the time, but I think it's entirely fair to say that the game is much more popular now than it was at that time. The license holders of Halloween have also shown themselves to be quite particular about how their characters are used, only allowing one extra outfit for both Michael and Laurie. These outfits, as a side note, released several years after the Halloween chapter came out. Regardless of all this, Behavior was able to obtain the license for the Halloween franchise, releasing the chapter on October 25th of 2016. I think they did the most they could have done with these characters, given the potential restrictions from the license holders. The trailer for this chapter is absolutely awesome. It still holds up really well even today. Everything from the music, the way the characters are presented, and the mood of the cinematic. It's perfect. Even if you know nothing about Halloween, you can just feel the influence of Michael Myers. I wasn't playing Dead by Daylight at the time this chapter was released, but I have to imagine it was somewhat controversial. Before I explain why, let me do a quick explanation of Michael Myers' power, Evil Within. It's a pretty simple concept. He has 3 tiers of Evil Within. He starts the match in tier 1, having literally no terror radius, but also moving quite slow and having a pitiful lunge attack. Michael can increase the level of his Evil Within by stalking survivors, an incredibly simple action that only requires you to physically see a survivor and hold mouse 2. Once you've stalked enough, you'll move up to Evil Within 2. In this form, Myers becomes a lot more similar to base killer stats. He has a normal lunge, the red stain actually appears, although his terror radius is still smaller than average, being 16 meters. One thing I've always found interesting about Myers is that tier 2 Evil Within gives him a slightly faster vaulting speed. Once Myers stalks enough in Evil Within 2, he'll move on to tier 3. This tier only lasts 60 seconds by default, after which he will regress back to Evil Within 2. In Evil Within 3, Myers has the default 32 meter terror radius, with the main buffs being a one-shot lunge attack, which is bigger than the average lunge, while also having a much faster vaulting speed. Michael's power is absolutely ingenious. I don't know how Behavior did it, but they managed to make a power that perfectly reflects the characters seen in the Halloween movies. When Myers is in Evil Within 1, you feel like you're in a literal horror movie, in which the threat can pop up at any moment, completely unannounced. Like a classic horror movie, however, the threat needs time to grow in power before it becomes truly deadly. The idea to make Myers stalk to increase his power is also perfect. It's literally exactly what he does in the movies, creating some really unique and spooky moments in game. There's really no feeling quite like playing Survivor and suddenly noticing a familiar shape in the distance as you work on a generator. Michael's power is, like many of the older designs, quite simple. There's still a good amount of depth to him, but the actual way his power functions is simple and easy to understand. Sound familiar? I mentioned earlier that I imagined Myers was controversial at the time of his release. Looking at his power is what made me think this. He has a one-shot down on a lunge attack, a small terror radius at times, and even the ability to vault faster. All of this doesn't sound too bad these days, but I have to imagine during that time period, people weren't as experienced at Survivor, so Myers was probably seen as a menace. Behavior seemed to agree, as Myers received a nerf to his power shortly after he released. These days, Myers tends to be placed in a mid-tier position by most people. His power is certainly something you have to respect, but it isn't the absolute scariest thing ever. One of Myers' best strengths is his ability to create huge snowball situations with Evil Within 3. There can be times where Myers can basically just end a game if survivors make mistakes against Evil Within 3, making him a threat that you always have to respect. The characters chosen to represent the Halloween franchise are exactly who you would expect them to be. Laurie Strode stars as a survivor for this chapter, and you already know that Michael Myers is the killer. Laurie suffers from the classic case of a mismatched face. Her face looks almost nothing like Jamie Lee Curtis. I think this likely happened because they were unable to get the rights to the actress's face, so they tried their best to make the character somewhat resemble Laurie Strode. Thankfully, Myers doesn't have this issue since he never truly had a face to show in the first place. Something that is really freaky about Michael's model is that you can actually see his eyes. It's not something you'll really ever see in normal gameplay since he needs to be in a bright light to show his eyes. Some could argue that this ruins the character of Michael, seeing as he's supposed to be the embodiment of true evil, and this makes him feel more human. I'd argue the opposite. I think that having eyes on his model makes him even more freaky. The eyes give away his humanity, but everything else about the character screams otherwise, which is a nice contrast in my opinion. It's pretty in line with the character of Michael, only barely being considered human. Speaking of the shape, I wanted to take a bit of time to talk about how well Dead by Daylight transfers him into its world. Myers is a fascinating character in his source material, and I think he can only be portrayed in very specific ways. Thankfully, Behavior does an excellent job at portraying the embodiment of evil. I talked about it earlier, but Myers' power is a perfect way to represent his actions in the Halloween films. He stalks from afar, gaining power as he does so. He can appear out of nowhere, while also being a threat that becomes much more obvious once he reaches Evil Within 3. One thing I particularly love about Evil Within 3 is the change in Myers' stance. It's an extremely simple change, but it perfectly portrays the threat he presents. Myers is also portrayed very well visually. He takes on the classic look from the original 1978 film, and all of his animations reflect the complete lack of life in him. He walks in a simple, direct manner. Many of his animations are really stiff. This lines up really well with the Myers we know from Halloween. He appears almost robotic, which is perfect for a character that essentially feels nothing. The only time he shows a bit of action comes from his lunge attacks, which makes complete sense, seeing as killing seems to be Michael's only interest. Another great part of his design is his breathing. It's really noticeable, although it sometimes gives his presence away early on in a match if a survivor is paying enough attention. The only place I feel Dead by Daylight fails to capture the character of Michael is in his stun sound effects. They sound a little off. The literal embodiment of evil sounds like he stubbed his toe when he gets stunned. I have to wonder why they didn't choose to give him some kind of breathing sound effect for getting stunned. Ghostface did this way better in a later chapter. His sounds make it seem like he is sighing, which is pretty fitting for the character. I'm not saying Myers should make no noise when getting stunned, that's kind of removing a crucial game mechanic. I do wish they'd change up his sounds though. Imagine how cool it'd be if he just breathed heavily after getting stunned. On the topic of sound design, Myers breaks quite a few previously established constants. Michael was the first killer to ever receive a unique terror radius and chase theme. I'm so glad that Behavior made this decision. Even all the way back then, they knew that getting chased by Myers would not have nearly the same impact if you used the default music from DBD. Instead, the game uses tracks very clearly inspired by the soundtrack of the Halloween films. There are even little tunes that play as Myers levels up his Evil Within. Michael's unique themes are perfect. They perfectly represent his franchise with piano sounds that completely portray that classic horror feel. It's one of the things that makes his appearance in the game feel so special. Something that is definitely lacking with some of the licensed characters that don't have unique themes. Michael even has a little snippet of music play when you select him on the menu. Simple, but so cool. One last thing that I find really neat about Myers is the way he fits into Dead by Daylight's lore and world. I imagine the Entity was quite pleased to pick up a killer as deadly as Michael, but in some ways I think the Entity is scared of him. It's never specifically stated, but I imagine that Michael is a being so powerful that even the Entity struggles to maintain control over him. Michael is probably fine being a part of the Entity's endless cycle of terror, and yet he is so strong that he can break some of the rules put in place by the Entity. Michael is the only killer in the game that has add-ons that allow him to Mori survivors, not even needing to down them a single time to do so. Sure, other killers may have the Mori offerings, but Myers can just walk up and do it given the right circumstances. I'll touch on his add-ons a little more later, but I think it's a great clue hinting towards Myers' immense power in the lore of the game, being able to completely disregard the conventional rules of the Entity's trials. The Halloween chapter, like most others, introduced 3 new perks for both killers and survivors. All of the perks revolved around the Obsession mechanic, a brand new mechanic created directly for this chapter. It's now a crucial part of the game, affecting many perks and add-ons. The mechanic is pretty simple. As long as certain perks are used, one of the survivors in the match will be the Obsession. Sometimes the Obsession can gain benefits for taking on the role, while other times it can be a downside. Just about every perk introduced in this chapter can be considered iconic, with almost all of them either being really powerful currently, or having been quite powerful in the past. I'll start with Michael's perks. Save the Best for Last is a fascinating design that I absolutely adore. It takes on an effect that was actually suggested by a community member, and it's an awesome effect. It basically works on a token system. Each time you hit someone that isn't your Obsession with a basic attack, you gain 1 token. Each time you hit your Obsession with a basic attack, you lose 2 tokens. These tokens grant an increase to your overall attack cooldown based on the amount you have. At 8 stacks, you recover from hits really quickly. Its effect can be a little confusing to understand for newer players, but I absolutely love what it does. It's oddly fitting thematically too, quite literally asking you to save the best, your Obsession, for last. Since sacrificing your Obsession locks your tokens to however many you had when they died, it having a reliance on basic attacks also allows for quite a lot of synergy with certain killers, one of the main ones being the Demogorgon. Save the Best used to function completely differently however, instead giving you a decreased cooldown on attacks so long as your Obsession is alive. Unrelenting also used to have the effect of decreasing the cooldown on both missed and successful attacks, so combining both perks together let you recover extremely fast from hits, and Save the Best didn't even require any work to reach that point. You just started with the benefits from the get-go. This build was sort of, insane. Save the Best was entirely reworked, and for good reason. The next Myers perk is Play with Your Food. This perk increases your movement speed for each time you let the Obsession escape in a chase, up to a maximum of 3 tokens. Each token increases your movement speed by 5%, but you lose 1 when attacking. This one is currently not that great. It takes forever to set up, and while the effect is undeniably good, it just isn't worth the setup time in most matches. Play with Your Food was also stronger at one point, instead increasing your movement speed by 7% for each token, and also having no cooldown for how quickly you could get tokens. I'm not even sure how this perk could be changed. Increasing a killer's movement speed can be really scary for chases. As it stands right now, this one is pretty forgettable, but there was a point in time where it was much better. Myers' last perk is Dying Light. This one has quite the history. Currently, the perk gives the Obsession a bonus to their healing speed. The catch is that each time you hook someone that isn't the Obsession, you get a token. Each token you gain decreases the general action speed of survivors, such as repairing generators or healing. The current Dying Light isn't super amazing. It takes a while to get going, and the values on it aren't particularly amazing. By the time Dying Light starts to become noticeable, you've basically already won the game, so it ends up being a pretty mediocre slowdown perk. And here's the part where I talk about the old version of this perk. Hoo boy. So, the old Dying Light had a similar boost to your Obsession's healing speed, but once your Obsession was sacrificed, it drastically slowed down the speed of gen repairs and healing. 25% to be exact. Dying Light certainly wasn't meta or anything back then, but it promoted a playstyle that just was not healthy for the game. It basically asked you to relentlessly tunnel your Obsession, making the game really hard for the survivors to win once you had done so. Most people would just bring in a Mori and immediately go for the Obsession. Keep in mind, this was when you could immediately Mori someone without even needing to hook them a single time. Even after Moris were nerfed for the first time, this strategy was still extremely effective. Go for your Obsession at the start, get a hook on them, then immediately go after them again and Mori them. It simply wasn't fun to face for anyone in the match, leading to the eventual change of Dying Light. Laurie's perks start off with one that is absolutely a dud. Soul Survivor's effect prevents your aura from being read by the killer within a range of 24 meters. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, the perk only starts to take effect once one of your teammates literally dies. Do I need to explain why this sucks? Soul Survivor really might be one of the worst perks in the game, but Laurie's other teachables far make up for it. Object of Obsession. I hate this perk. I don't think there's a single killer player that likes this perk. Object allows the survivor using it to see the killer's aura from up to 72 meters away, so long as you are outside of their terror radius. The killer also sees the survivor's aura anytime they do this, but Object won't do anything if the survivor looks in a direction away from the killer. This perk is fundamentally broken. Good survivor players can make your life really frustrating with it. If you're playing something like Trapper, they can see your every move, basically making your power worthless. Beyond that, they had to entirely change how multiple stealth killers functioned, almost entirely because of Object. See, many killers didn't have the undetectable status while using their abilities, such as Wraith or Pig. This meant that Object users could literally always see them, since these killers had no terror radius. Thankfully, undetectable was added as an effect for some killers, which completely hides their aura. preventing them from being seen with object. Behavior recently showed a work-in-progress rework to the perk, so I really hope they go through with that at some point. And then there's Decisive Strike. What is there to say about this perk that hasn't already been said? Decisive Strike, which I'll be shortening to DS, has gone through multiple changes and is still an incredibly strong perk. Currently, if the killer picks you up within 60 seconds of being unhooked, you can hit a skill check to instantly escape from the killer's grasp, stunning them for 5 seconds. I'll do a quick lightning round of every previous version of DS, since there have been a lot. The first version of DS could be used at any time. Literally all the killer had to do was pick you up. For a while, Enduring actually affected the stun duration of DS, giving you a much shorter stun if you had the perk equipped. The next version of DS was the same, but had a 4-second stun instead of 5. After this, DS was changed so that only the Obsession could immediately hit a skill check. Any survivors that weren't the Obsession had to wiggle to 35%. It's probably worth mentioning that older versions of DS didn't trigger the skill check instantly, so the killer could walk for a small bit and then drop you. This was called dribbling, and many killers during the time would do it to prevent a DS from going off. The next version of DS is the same one we have today, but the stun duration is only 3 seconds instead of 5. It was later buffed to the current version. So, yeah. This perk has been changed an incredible amount of times, and still remains one of the strongest survivor perks in the game. Behavior describes the perk as being an anti-tunnel perk, which is an aspect I like about the perk. My issue with this is that many survivors attempt to use DS offensively instead of defensively. Many players will jump in lockers in your face, or just generally be really aggressive when they have DS up. Thankfully, DS is receiving yet another change in the future. It has the same duration and stun effect, but will deactivate once you do one of many actions, such as healing or repairing generators. I really like this proposed change, and I hope they go through with it. DS will still be really useful in situations where you're actually getting tunneled, while preventing those frustrating moments as killer where survivors literally run at you, trying to bait it out. This map sucks. Okay, fine, I'll tell you why. Haddonfield is one of the oldest maps in the game. It's pretty obvious that it's old, both by its map design and its graphics. Seriously, as more maps get graphic updates, I can't help but feel like Haddonfield starts to look worse and worse in comparison. It's not necessarily terrible, but it's very obviously dated. As far as map design goes, Haddonfield's is genuinely one of the worst in the game. Tons of gens are placed high up on the second floor of buildings, requiring you to walk a really long way to get to them. That's not even mentioning the fact that doing this gives survivors a huge amount of time to run away, making many of the gens on this map extremely safe to repair. The main building on Haddonfield is the epitome of this, with multiple god windows and a generator that always spawns on the second floor. Alongside this, Haddonfield has many other extremely strong buildings, such as the infamous House of Pain, another absurd building that is guaranteed to spawn on the map. It possesses many extremely strong windows and a god palette. This structure also appears on the Batum preschool maps, but after the graphic update, it's much more manageable. There's breakable walls, as well as making the stairs on the bottom floor not nearly as see-through, which heavily lowers the strength of the building. Haddonfield is also a map that heavily benefits balanced landing. Balance is normally a fine perk, but Haddonfield makes it feel extremely oppressive. This really isn't the fault of balanced landing, but rather the more vertical design of Haddonfield. There's an absurd number of spots that you can use balance, with many of them being really strong window vaults that just aren't seen on other maps. As a whole, Haddonfield is a ridiculous map. It's generally very unfun to play on as killer, and I'd even argue it isn't super fun as survivor. It doesn't contain a lot of the more generic jungle gym tiles from the classic maps, so many chases are basically just triple vaulting god windows. The map promotes gameplay that is overall quite boring, so I'm really hoping that the eventual graphic update it will receive will fix up some of its balance issues. Michael brings a lot to the table when it comes to gameplay. If you're playing Survivor, I'd say that he brings excitement to most matches he is present in. The start is oddly quiet, and just as you realize something's off, you'll often end up seeing Myers on the edge of your screen, just watching. Beyond this, Myers is an M1 killer, so he feels fair to be chased by. He doesn't have any crazy gimmicks outside of add-ons, and even with Evil Within 3, Myers is still what many people would call an M1 killer. The only time Myers can feel a bit frustrating as Survivor are those specific situations where he stalks your teammates a bunch, 99s his Evil Within 3, and then pops it on you. It can feel a little annoying to get punished for the mistakes of your teammates, but it's not an extremely big issue. As far as playing Michael goes, I find him to be simple but pretty enjoyable. There isn't too much extra stuff you have to learn as him, making him a nice choice for beginners. Aspects of his kit can help an experienced player too, however. I find his extra vaulting speed in Evil Within 3 really useful in certain situations. For me personally, I'm not a huge fan of the whole setup phase Myers has. Sure, other killers have this too. Many people would point to Trapper or Hag. Those killers can actually function even during the setup phase though, while Evil Within 1 Myers is basically unusable in a chase. Usually if things are going alright, you shouldn't be in Evil Within 1 for too long, but it's a part of his gameplay that doesn't really suit my tastes. I have to say though, it is pretty fun just lurking in the shadows, feeding off an unsuspecting survivor. Without trying to sound too much like a Batman game reviewer, this really makes you feel like Michael Myers. It's pretty hilarious seeing how people respond to your presence once they realize they're being watched. One thing I do like about Myers is his interesting snowball and comeback potential. I had this match that wasn't really going my way, but one good use of Evil Within 3 basically won it all back for me. That's the thing with Michael. Even when all feels lost, you can sometimes just sort of pull a win out of nowhere. It's a nice feeling, and something that I wanted to bring up for anybody getting into playing Myers. Never give up, there's always a chance you can pull a game back. Oh boy, here comes the part where I talk about silly add-on design. I don't think this add-on is a problem, but I wanted to talk a bit about the scratched mirror. It essentially gives you wall hacks on nearby survivors while you are stalking, but you can never leave Evil Within 1. This creates what many people call the Jump Scare Myers build. Most players using this build will bring an indoor map offering, and use the information gained from the add-on to jump scare survivors at corners. To be honest, in my opinion, this add-on isn't really strong. I view it more as a joke personally. It's an extremely powerful camping tool, but little ounce. The Tombstone add-ons. Oh my, these are the ones I talked about earlier. They allow you to instantly Mori a survivor while you're in Evil Within 3. Sure, they have some drawbacks and can take a little while to set up, but these add-ons are just flat out dumb. You can walk up to a player that you've literally not seen once in the match and just Mori them on the spot, if you've stalked their other teammates enough. Taking a survivor immediately out of the game is absolutely insane. I feel bad for running these add-ons to get gameplay. I'm sorry to you, and I'm also sorry to you. Once again, these add-ons are dumb. The Halloween chapter is a really interesting addition to Dead by Daylight. If I had to use a word to describe the chapter, I would call it iconic. It includes one of horror's most iconic killers, while on the gameplay side of things, it includes a map that is certainly iconic for better or worse. Even the perks feel iconic. Almost every perk introduced in this chapter is really strong currently, or was strong at a previous point in time. The obsession mechanic is an interesting new addition to the game, but many of the perks based around it are either poorly designed or simply too strong. Haddonfield is a map that is generally quite unfun to play on, but the silver lining of this chapter is Michael Myers. He has an ingenious yet simple design. The character of Michael from the movies is translated quite well into the world of Dead by Daylight, being both fun to play and exciting to go against. If you haven't played Myers yet, I'd definitely recommend giving him a try. He's a solid choice for newer players, while also being interesting enough to play for experienced players too. So get out there and spook some survivors.